Hey, hello, and welcome to the panel Cardboard Stories, Narrative Games as Works of Literature. Um, I am Dave Neale, and I am a narrative board game designer, um, and also an affiliate of the Pedal Play Research Centre at the University of Cambridge. And I have two other people with me, Emma.
Hi, yes, my name is Emma, and I am a doctoral researcher in the education faculty at the University of Cambridge and a lecturer in game design at the University of Southampton. My research is kind of located at the intersection between childhood studies and video game studies, but I am also really interested in analog games and kind of the overlap between the digital and the analog. And I also have a kind of newfound love for tabletop role-playing games. And actually, so Dave and me were colleagues at the education faculty in Cambridge. But just before the pandemic, they started as the game master for a role-playing game that we've been managing to keep up with via Skype over the course of the pandemic, which has been really good fun. And also, actually, I had my first stab at being a game master, pun intended, because it was a pirate-themed game mission. But yeah, I had my first stab at being a game master with my first year undergraduates, and yeah, I think I had some moderate success in doing so. So yeah, that's me, and that's why I'm here.
Hi, I am Kirsten. I'm a lecturer in analog game design and interactive writing at Wits University in South Africa. So I am quite interested in board games and stories and the overlap. I'm also doing my PhD looking at behavioral economic principles applied to the making and playing of board games. But that's not for today. That's me.
Oh, okay. Well, we're going to start by giving a couple of short presentations, and then we're kind of going to go from there into a more general discussion. And after the presentations, if people out there have questions or comments or whatever, feel free to put them in the Twitch chat, and then we'll respond to them as they come in and as we can. So to begin, as a general introduction, I'm giving a shortened version of a talk I've given before, specifically about board games, card games, and game books as literature. So I think today we can also talk about things like tabletop role-playing games as narrative games, but for this particular presentation, that wasn't something I focused on. But so this specifically deals with these things and is an area I don't think there has been, well, I'm pretty sure there hasn't been a lot of research on looking at analog tabletop games from this perspective. There's been more on video games, but even there, I don't think there's nowhere near the amount that's been dedicated to other narrative media like movies and novels, etc. So to begin, as many people out there may well already know, board games are very old. Oh, I'll start off with this actually. Just want to mention that me and Emma run a room on Sundays in Clubhouse, which is now open to people who use Android, finally. So you can register for Clubhouse or get on it with invites. And if you're on Clubhouse, then we're doing this room every Sunday at 12:30, which is basically about cultural and psychological sort of aspects of games and game design. This is the one this Sunday. Can games change the world? So yeah, it'd be great to see people there if you can get to that. So board games, as you know, are very old. We have chess, over 1,000 years old, Nine Men's Morris, older, Go, even older, and Senet that the ancient Egyptians played 5,000 years ago. And it seems to be the case that they could go back around 8,000 years. A Neolithic board game discovered through an archaeological dig. And 8,000 years is an incredible amount of time because it basically means that humans were playing games when there were still woolly mammoths walking around, before they invented the wheel, and before they'd ever ridden a horse, and before they invented writing. So it means that board games are essentially, with oral storytelling and the visual arts as one of the earliest forms of human creative expression. And yet, despite that incredibly long history, they're generally regarded in kind of Western culture, at least now, as sort of lesser than other creative media in some regards, lesser in the way that they can convey meaning, or and that they're sort of lighter, they're simply for entertainment value, a shallower form of expression in some ways, how a lot of people see them. And yet they clearly don't have to be seen in this way, and we can see in games like Senet, which had a lot of religious significance and signified deep themes for the ancient Egyptians. Go is often seen as a game that can teach things about life and has a lot of deep meaning and thought and feeling behind it. So it's clearly that games can be more than this, but for some reason that's the perspective that has dominated in a certain cultural context in recent years. So if we think about games and literature specifically, the first example I really know of them coming together explicitly was in sort of the 1930s with Dennis Wheatley's crime dossiers. And he was one of the world's best-selling authors at the time, which is kind of weird when you think about it, that one of the world's best-selling authors, he did this interactive narrative thing in the 1930s. That just, it feels like that's sort of unlikely for that to have happened, but it did. And these were incredibly successful. He did sell a lot of them. He did 4 or 5, I think, in the end. And so they were very light on the game angle in that they weren't very structured, but they were basically solve it yourself cases where you open it up. It was a dossier that you went through one thing at a time, a series of letters, series of reports. They had real physical evidence like pieces of hair, old matches. For the hair, apparently they had women in the factory had to actually cut hair off and put it in the things. They were like genuine clues they included in this stuff that you had to go through. So that was one of the first examples. And then that, as many people will be aware, developed into things like the Choose Your Own Adventure books and the Fighting Fantasy books. And so here we have a kind of intersection of narrative and game principles, interactive narratives, as a kind of fledgling idea that developed over the century, really. And these kind of books, the emphasis tends to be on the game and the puzzle aspect much more than the writing, the theme, the characters, or any of the other like more traditional literary components. And so they fall into that same kind of set that I was talking about, that same perspective I was talking about, where there's this view that something that is a game doesn't sort of necessarily have to have this sort of more deeper, meaningful aspect to it. But then it also raises the question of whether the interaction itself is something that can be examined and understood in a more literary way, and whether that conveys meaning sometimes in an interesting manner, which perhaps other media cannot do in the same way, other storytelling media. Then we move on from there to storytelling board games, which have become more and more popular, like over the past 10 years or so. Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, which I did the latest set for, originally came out in the 80s. And I was probably influenced by Dennis Wheatley's crime dossiers, I would think. And it was kind of ahead of its time. And it was when it was, the original box for it was re-released in around 2012, I think. That seemed to kind of spark a lot of other storytelling games. It sparked escape room games like Unlock, which I've also worked on. And I know that with Unlock specifically, it started off as very much trying to emulate an escape room where you were sort of trapped in a room and you were looking for keys to open boxes and codes and stuff. And the publisher has pushed more and more in the direction of making it more narrative focused, lots of different types of stories that it can tell with this card system and the app. And just to show a game that is coming out in the next couple of months, a recent narrative game I've worked on, Echoes from Ravensburger, which primarily uses audio through an app, kind of like a radio play or a divided up radio play along with cards, and you're trying to piece together what happened using those cues. And one thing about these storytelling games is they're incredibly different from each other. And if you think about, there are other games like, for example, Once Upon a Time by James Wallace and Andrew Willstone, where you are playing cards and essentially collaboratively creating a story. So it's much more fluid and open. You're not discovering a pre-existing narrative, but you are creating one together. So this massive range, I think, brings us to what distinguishes these storytelling board games as a medium from other storytelling mediums. And I think one is that they have this very diverse structure. They can be all different kinds of things. They can have multiple endings or one ending to the story that's being created. They can have pre-existing narratives that the players are discovering versus player-created narratives, or something in between the two. They can contain very little text. They can be primarily images, symbols, interaction between players, components, mechanisms as metaphors, which Emma's going to talk about in a minute. They can contain a lot of text rather than so very little text or a lot of text. My Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective set is longer than the average novel by about 30,000 words. So there's a massive variety in the amount of text they can contain. So potentially, and this is kind of a question, they're potentially more structurally diverse than other storytelling media in structure. I don't think so in content, but structure perhaps. And they're also they're incredibly successful. People love interactive stories, so they've boomed because they are so popular. So it also makes them, I think, very more relevant as a narrative form, and something that is definitely worthy of more understanding, more interrogation, more analysis in the kind of way that's been given to video games to some extent, but to a large extent to literature and to movies. So to finish, I will just briefly give some thoughts on this idea of interaction as a literary device, and essentially questions that I feel the idea raises. There is obviously something about agency and empowerment in interaction. So that, I think, affects the text or the game, the thing, and how the player engages with it and experiences it differently than if it's a passive thing. Do they perceive the meaning in a different way versus if they experience the same content passively? I think the answer is yes, but how we understand that and in what ways is more of an open question. And there's the discovery or the creation of plot and character through these interactions. Players often fill in the gaps. So certain things may interact with each other, and players will be like, oh, that means this happened and this happened, and they will kind of fill that story in to explain the game interaction. And there may be things like that happen that the designer did not actually anticipate, which is kind of a great thing sometimes in some ways, and could also be a problem in other ways, I think, because it can create game system problems, like the game might break down in some way because the correct information isn't conveyed to the players. It could even have unsavory implications. It could create situations where sort of suddenly a prejudice comes through. There's some kind of racial discrimination or gender discrimination that comes through from two things being combined in a certain way that wasn't anticipated or expected. So I think there are all kinds of possibilities in that. And related to those kind of ideas, how do we interpret something that has all these multiple versions of itself and could be experienced very differently by different readers or players, and associated lack of authorial control? So they're the questions I wanted to end this presentation with, and that we can then explore further afterwards. But now I will turn it over to Emma to talk about metaphor and mechanism.
Thanks very much. I will try to share my screen, and hopefully you guys can let me know if you can see it all right. So yeah, just maybe Dave, if you could tell me or give me a thumbs up if you can see that. Is that working?
Yeah.
Sweet. All right. I now can't see you guys because my slides is the only I can see, but I'll go with it anyways. Okay, yeah, so to kind of follow on from like the really interesting questions that Dave has raised there, and already I have a lot of thoughts. I'd like to add like another provocation, I'm going to call it, which I hope will be like, a potentially interesting and fruitful starting point for a kind of roundtable discussion that we have. So yes, the provocation is this. story lives or dies in the telling. We know this because we all have that one friend who, whenever they narrate an event, something that's happened to them, no matter how interesting the event is or how invested we are in the event, after a couple of minutes, we're bored and we're kind of confused, and our neck is basically just like cramping from nodding along. And yeah, if you don't have one of those friends, I'm sorry to tell you, you might be that friend. Storytelling is an art, and like any art form, it is also a science. And while there is no silver bullet for storytelling, when something works for us, and it is subjective, but when something works for us, we can break it down into its constituent parts to understand why, kind of like pulling apart, the pieces of a clock, like this slide is demonstrating. So I wanted to talk you through an example, which is of a written story, although not a traditionally written story, and then speak about how we can apply that same process to thinking about board game mechanics. You're probably familiar with this. So this story emerged from a game, or more specifically from a contest. It's an apocryphal tale, but supposedly it did. And the challenge of this contest was narrate a story using only 6 words. And this 6-word story, which is commonly attributed to Hemingway, although again, apocryphally, is powerful, not just because of its economy, not just because it answers the specifications of the rules of the contest, but because the tight-lipped, sparse brevity of it is part of its storytelling. Saying so much in so few words mirrors the tiny span of the infant's life, or the small size of the unborn's body, replete with possibilities, with things unsaid and undone. Its short earth hours are haunted by the subtext of a whole life unlived.
Emma, can I just say I can only see your first screen at the moment.
Oh, you can't see me change the slide? Nothing's changing?
It says mechanics as metaphors at the moment.
Oh no, so when I...
Are you seeing the same, Kirsten, just to check? You're seeing the first screen, right?
Yeah, I can only see the first slide.
Weird. Okay, I'm clicking through. Well, I'll tell you what the story is. There's added suspense there. The 6-word story is for sale, baby shoes, never worn. Apologies. The rest of my slides aren't so important, so I can maybe just read them out if you guys can't see them. Sorry about that. I don't know why that's not working. So that's the story that I was already digging into. So the other thing about as I said, the brevity of this telling is that it also evokes the numbness of grief. So how grief isn't always a burst pipe of tears and howls, but is sometimes grief can be the valve that turns off your emotions, leaving you only with dry monosyllables. And then we have the word never, which is a devastating, unyielding judgment. The writer, potentially Hemingway, could have chosen the word unworn, like baby shoes unworn, and then he would have surpassed the requirements of the contest, and he would have told the story in only 5 words. And also he would have included then like a shadow rhyme with the word unborn. But we need the word never so that we understand both the despair and the finality of the conclusion of this very short story. The word unworn, for example, introduces the possibility that the mother simply didn't like the design of the baby shoes, and not that this baby would never set foot in the world. And finally, we have the visual image that is invoked here, which is a metaphor for the death of the baby. And that is a tiny pair of shoes. So unlike a soft item of clothing, like a jumper or a pair of socks, shoes are structured receptacles, which is a very weird way to think about them, but they are, and they are shaped to the foot that they were made to fit. They stand empty when they are not in use. These baby shoes, the image invoked here, are empty ever after. They are unfillable. So this kind of formalist critique doesn't usually work that well for games analysis, because a game is not its rules and components. Tennis is not rackets, balls, and lines on the ground. Games are lived experiences. And again, so my next slide, which I will now read out to you, it's a joke tweet, but it's someone called Nick, and he's saying, hey, so I'm calling to ask about the baby shoes. Are they still available? Great, I just had a baby, so, the poor kid needs some kicks. So were they never worn, or maybe worn just a little bit? No, never. So did the baby just not like the shoes, or did, and then the word tweet ends. And I put this tweet up to kind of illustrate, obviously this is a tongue-in-cheek joking one, but the fact that, yeah, with written text, there are, of course, always these recalcitrant readers who will always like go against the grain of a text. But yeah, much more so, games are shaped by the players in ways that are, yeah, just more fundamental and more kind of substantive than, readers of books. Although arguably readers of poems, but one thing that Dave brought up there that I thought was really interesting was that the interpretive gaps might be, we could consider those as literary devices. And actually, when we think about the difference between literary language and non-literary language, or poetic language and literal language, one of the ways that we differentiate between them is we say literary language has more interpretive gaps. There's more space between the signifier and the signified on purpose to leave that room for subjective and multiple and kind of polysemic interpretations. Whereas at the other end of the spectrum, literal language, unpoetic language, like the language that you might find inside an IKEA manual of how to, build a chest of drawers, that has to have no interpretive gaps. It has to be ideally a one-to-one correlation between signifier and signified and no other potential things, because it's already hard enough to build like an IKEA set of drawers without wondering whether the hammer is a metaphor for communism or something. So I thought that was interesting, but that's, anyway. Yeah, so interpretive gaps are enormous in games because the interpretive gap is basically the shape of the player, and without the player, the game is it's unconcretized. And I know, again, reader response theorists say that all texts are only concretized in the moment that they are read. But I think, yeah, narrative games take what kind of Fisher and Iser and Northrop Frye and everyone to a massive extreme, which is that there is no game without a player. That said, I still think that close readings of a game's constituent parts can provide a useful map of the terrain that can then subsequently be explored through ethnography or autoethnography or any other kind of player response criticism. So that was to say, basically, the formalist criticism is really good at giving us a set of terms and typologies that can help us communicate more clearly when we then analyze the aesthetic experience of a live playthrough, and basically just pushes us beyond being like, dead baby make player moderate sad, you know what I mean? Like, and obviously there are games in which dead babies are not sad. Dead babies can be really fun in games. I'm thinking of Bears versus Babies, the board game by the Oatmeal guys who made Exploding Kittens. That's a game where babies get dead, and it's pretty hilarious. Yes, I hope I don't get like sound bite quoted out of context there, but dead babies are fun in that context. What happens when we appraise narrative game mechanics as if they were metaphors? In the sense that not only do the actions taken in a game narrate an event, but they do so in a way that is apt and eloquent, profound, and beautiful even. There is some consensus about what makes a good metaphor, so it's one that's not hackneyed or cliched, but it should resonate with us nonetheless. So it should defamiliarize something whilst also making it feel newly familiar, so familiar afresh kind of thing. It should draw our attention to the subject's particularities, to its connotations, and to its multisensory nature. It might also draw attention to the subject's, to the surface of language, so to the look or the sound of a word. And I think it's a bit too easy to fall to thinking of rolling a die, or moving a counter, or drawing a card as something that is inherently abstract and that doesn't carry any additional meaning. Because we know that doing these actions makes us feel something. Drawing a card can feel strange, or it can feel familiar. It can feel really awkward, or it can feel really intuitive. And on top of that, it can also make us feel many more complex emotions. So my question is, how can we, as designers, players, and critics, attune ourselves to the aesthetic and poetic qualities of the actions that we take in games? And how will that change the way we approach expressing narrative in tabletop games specifically? Do we always have to aim for mechanics that fade into the background when we play? So like kind of aiming for mechanics that are essentially dead metaphors. So a dead metaphor is something like the leg of a table, where we no longer think about actual legs when we think about the leg of a table, because it's a dead metaphor. And often I think in game design classes, and I'm calling myself out here because this is something I've done before, is that we try to tell our students, that we don't want the game mechanic out and obtrude. We want them to feel really natural. And yeah, again, playing a video game, you don't want to remind the player that they have something in their hands. You don't want to remind the player that they have fingers on a keyboard. You want to almost make the hands and the board and the interface invisible. So my question is, what happens when we deliberately have the mechanics obtrude and draw attention to them and to their meaning? So the way we do that in language, in verbal language or written language, is through sound patterning, rhythm, register, connotations, and so on. But in tabletop board game design, we have at our disposal an equally rich set of signifiers. So we have weight, for one, and I mean, like, what would it mean to make a counter ridiculously heavy, for example, other than making an absolute nightmare to distribute? We have size, shape, texture, color, art style. We have like the number of components as well. So I was thinking as well, like, is an apt metaphor for love holding one card or holding 15 cards? And again, we don't really know that through playtesting and so on. We have the patterns that are made by the game pieces when they're in play. Like, how could you show, for example, a metaphor for loneliness by how the pieces move around during a particular play session? We can see randomness as a metaphor, and we can make it a meaningful metaphor by manipulating probability, and also by choosing how we subject our players to randomness. So using a spinner feels very different to rolling a die, and rolling one 6-sided die obviously feels very different to rolling 3 20-sided dice, and so on. And we can use gesture as a metaphor, so different levels of dexterity, for example, or like different movement speeds. And there's a video game that I think does this so well in terms of using gesture as metaphor, but I've yet to see it kind of happen as powerfully in a board game, although it would be really interesting if anyone has any examples that come to mind. In fact, there was a tabletop role-playing game we played called Icarus, which is like a one-shot TTRPG. And in that, every time something goes wrong in the game, you have to start stacking up the dice that you can roll into one single tower. They're like 6-sided dice. And if your tower falls, it means the collapse of your nation. I thought that was like a really interesting use of not gesture as metaphor, but components as metaphor. Anyway, that's a sidetrack. Yes, in a narrative tabletop game, the so-called aesthetic considerations should not just be thought of in service of the rules. They are not just simply vehicles that convey the rules. They carry an equal burden of telling the story. What is more, as scholars like Tara Fickle in her book, The Race Card, has recently pointed out, I'm so sad you can't see my slide right now because I have an Alan Partridge gif that none of you will get to see. It's him going back of the net, which might be a very niche British television show, which no one else gets. But anyway, so Tara Fickle points out that already the English language is bursting with gaming metaphors. And we can kind of reverse engineer this relationship between the signifier and the signified again. So the ones I have on my slide right now are things like a stacked deck, luck of the draw, play the hand you're dealt, play your cards right, hit the jackpot, double down, raise the stakes, playing with your heart, joker in the pack, ace up your sleeve, a dog in the race, it's hard won, he's a player, don't be a spoil sport, it's just a game. We have to overcome these hurdles. I'm on a winning streak. I'm going to throw you a curveball. All of those things are, just the first ones I can think of, and there are many more. But yeah, maybe we could use those to our advantage when we're expressing ourselves through the physical performance of play to kind of, draw on the connotations that they have in language. So to conclude, here are some ways to frame questions that we might then be able to answer through close readings that look at mechanics in the same way that we look at metaphors in language. So for example, are there tabletop mechanics that can make you feel grief, that can actually make you grieve, that can set you up for a loss and elicit that emotion? Which actions best describe the experience of synthesizing clues in the style of Sherlock Holmes? And obviously, Dave, you can talk about your experience here. But do you feel more like Sherlock Holmes when you are, turning over a card versus when you are moving a counter, for example? Which mechanics convey the trusting bond between a team of misfits who have to band together to save the world? So again, in cooperative games, like what mechanics actually not just describe the bond that you share with other players, but actually describes it in a way that's poetic. So is from each other's hand, or is it moving somebody else's piece as they move yours in like simultaneously without talking? Or again, I think the game, oh my goodness, I'm blanking on it. It's the one in space. It's like a trick-taking card game and no one can speak. I'll look it up, but I think that does that really well.
Crew?
Yes, thank you. The Crew. Yeah, and then finally, which mechanics best describe the trepidation and then the abject horror of encountering a Lovecraftian monster? And I would love to kind of, dig into some of those questions with everyone in the round table. And I'm sorry you can't see my slides. My social media handle is @EmmaJoyReay, Reay. And that's on my slide, but y'all can't see it. So I'm just going to exit my slideshow now.
Okay, Kirsten, do you want to go and introduce yourself and kind of, say whatever thoughts you have on this topic in general?
Sure, thank you. Thank you both. That was really interesting. So I'm here because I've done quite a lot of work and spent quite a lot of time studying narrative board games quite closely. I should say that the way that I've defined narrative board games are games, and this comes from Marco Arnaudo's book, Storytelling Board Games, games that already contain the kind of full lexicon of content required to form a narrative. So games like Time Stories or Mansions of Madness, as opposed to what I've called storytelling games, games like Gloom or Tales of the Arabian Nights, which ask players to more actively participate in the creation of the story. Those games rely on the creativity and imagination of the players to put prompts and components together to form a story. So a lot of the work that I've done has been thinking about whether narrative board games, in the way that I've thought about them, count as narrative in the way that we traditionally think about narrative and narratological kind of ideas. And in short, I believe the answer is yes. And I've done a lot of work saying why. So you can contact me if you want to see that work. But if we assume that narrative board games are forms of narrative, and narratives are made up of two parts, the story and the form. So the content, what happens, and in the form, how that content is presented, then that framework provokes some really interesting questions for how we consider narrative board games and their narrative structure. And a lot of the thinking that I've done, I think, ties in quite nicely to what Dave and Emma have presented. So, for example, if we think about the form of the narrative game, we can think about how the mechanics are part of the form of that narrative. The components of the game are part of the form because they're part of the way the story is being presented. But taking that further, the player is part of the form because it's through the player's actions, the decisions that they make by playing the game, that they elicit the story, that the narrative is experienced. And so I think, I don't want to talk too much because we've only got 20 minutes left, and I'm curious to hear the questions. But for me, what you're saying speaks very closely to a lot of the thinking and the work that I've done, which is thinking about the role of the player and how the role of the player and whether they could be considered a narrator, for example, in the way that we traditionally think of the narrator. And how the player and the player's interaction and participation with the system of the game, with the system of the narrative, creates an entirely new kind of narratological framework. I don't know what that framework is yet, but I think that there's a lot of really interesting games coming out that are expanding the way that we think about narrative and how we can position the player in terms of their kind of active creation of the story.
If I could just come in super quickly before we go to the questions, just to bounce off what you were just saying there, Kirsten. Yeah, in like with digital games, like we are kind of constantly encouraged to think of the player as like part of the hardware of the game. So rather than like trying to move beyond like a sort of anthropomorphic centric view into seeing like a more relational dynamic between the console or the computer and the player. So thinking about the player mind as a type of computer, but also thinking about the player's body as a type of controller. And and always asking the question, like when we say controller, we never talk about the directionality of that control, but actually the player thinks of it as their opening into the game world, which is like the means through which they exert agency. But of course, it's very much a two-way thing in that the game itself can make the player's hands move in a specific way, and can basically choreograph and direct the player and control the player essentially in a kind of reciprocal way. So it's like much more of a sort of looped experience than we would like to believe, because we don't want to see ourselves as like non-autonomous agents and so on. But I'm interested, I wonder how that applies to board games and tabletop games, and whether that metaphor of like the hardware still stands, whether we could say the player is a component or something like that. Sorry, please do go for the questions. I just wanted to give in while that was in my mind.
Well, just to respond quickly, I think what's interesting about board games versus digital games is, you know, when I'm playing a digital game, I push the button and the thing happens. When you're playing a board game, you have to make the thing happen. It doesn't happen for you. And so the player, there is a lot more responsibility just in terms of the kind of logistics and administration of the play session, that the player is responsible. And I think positions them in a slightly different way than I think they're positioned in digital games. Thank you.
Yeah, I can actually, I've just opened I can see some of the chat here, so I can see that someone has talked about, I can see there's a reference to unambiguous language in the game rules, while interpretive opportunities in the game itself, which is an interesting sort of juxtaposition you have. I guess you do want that literal language you talked about, Emma, in the rules themselves, but you want something different potentially in the actual game.
It really depends on the game as well. Because oh, sorry, go on, Dave. Finish your thought.
What did you say? Depends on the theme.
I was going to say, I recently, with my first years, we looked at Brave Sparrow, which is like a single player. I'm not even sure how I would actually, I don't know what genre to ascribe it to, but it's a kind of single player role playing game that involves collecting feathers, and you imagine yourself into being a part of the secret society of people who used to be sparrows but have had their sparrow trapped inside this cumbersome human form. And as you're out in the world, you're collecting feathers to regain your wings, essentially. But being a sparrow is not just about flying. Being a sparrow is also about being brave, being kind, and all these other things as well. And again, the rules. And again, we talk about things like, the flavor text. Oh yeah, you can get the narrative conveyed through your rules, but through word choice and so on, and through the art that you include. But the rules of that game are really deliberately vague and also bizarre and absurd, to the point that you have to actually take actions and play the game. It's the responsibility of the player to kind of collapse down the kind of multivocality of the rules into like, okay, it must mean this, because otherwise I physically cannot go out and take actions unless but then again, the part of that is then the subjective experience of being like, of not only co-narrating the story, but co-authoring the rules.
There is a board game, I can't remember the name of it, which is essentially just all about making up the rules. You all get to decide a rule. That's all it is from the beginning, and you gradually build up rules more and more and more. But then the other thing, you said that was a role-playing game, right? Because one thing that struck me is, and I guess this is kind of obvious where it would happen, but a lot of the kind of things we talked about, a lot of innovation in that kind of domain, and examples I can think of are in sort of the kind of indie tabletop role-playing space. And I did see on the chat they mentioned The Quiet Year, where you place a coin that just sits there and represents contempt. It's the contempt mechanic. You just place it on the table there. And you mentioned Icarus and stacking the dice, and it also made me think of 10 Candles, the game where you light the candles and they gradually go out, and that represents change in the world that you're playing in. And so, yeah, I think there are good examples of metaphor using physical objects in indie tabletop role playing, which I can think of less immediate examples in board games. But one thing that did strike me, and I'm in a panel about this later, is of course legacy games and the idea of having to rip up cards and things and destroy components, which obviously has that whole emotional quality and is obviously a strong metaphor for real destruction. If somebody dies in a game, or if you're destroying something, if you actually rip up their character card, then you've got that metaphor right in your face, and some people like really feel that. So yeah, that seems like quite a clear example of that kind of thing.
The game Holding On, which is behind me, The Troubled Life of Billy Kerr, one of the most impactful experiences with the component that I've had, other than in my playing of legacy games, and I'm looking forward to your talk later, Dave. In Holding On, you have nurses, and nurses can get stressed when they have to work extra shifts, do a number of activities. And the nurses are represented by pawns, just normal pawns. They're a turquoise color. And then the stress token is a punched out token, so there's a hole in the middle. And when a nurse is stressed, you take the little circle and you put it on top of the pawn. So there's literally this physical representation of stress on the shoulder of this kind of disembodied nurse. And that metaphor of the stress and the weight of the work that they do was so impactful when I played it.
That sounds amazing. Like, yeah, I think that's a really good example. I'm going to have to put that on my list of games to buy.
I highly recommend it. It's a really interesting game.
I was also thinking of what something Dave said in giving your like amazing speed run through the history of board games, was that of course board games do actually have this, they have a religious genealogy as well as like a leisure genealogy, and I'm using religious really expansively there, maybe I should say spiritual as well, in the sense that they are rituals. And it also makes me think of like Johann Huizinga's kind of his take on play, which he says that, you know, all culture grows out of play, including religion and including the other kind of ritualistic things that we do, and the fact that maybe we can think of board game components as like talismans almost, or as like totems, I guess, and the actions that we do in the same way that video games are like simulated worlds. What we're doing is we're simulating actions, we're play acting real life actions, obviously on a small level, like chess is a small war or whatever, but to try and like reinfuse some of that ritualistic and spiritual dignity or tradition or heritage into board games, trying to basically remind people that this is the kind of history of board games. And maybe that's a way as well, what you've noted, Dave, that board games aren't necessarily thought of in the context of like being the high point of human expression, even though they are a part of who we are, and they're as much a kind of they're a part of our identities and our expression as any other kind of art form. So maybe that's a kind of a way to approach it. There's that game as well about the snake god, where they discovered the board, but they didn't know whether the board predated the religion or the religion predated the board. They think that the religion may have actually grown out of this kind of sort of tarot style, not fortune telling, you know what I mean, like rune reading type of board game. And again, it just kind of makes me think that there is such weight to these actions. They're not kind of frivolous necessarily, although they can be, and that can be really fun. I don't know what I'm saying now, but religion and board games, discuss.
I think there you also have the metaphor of like chance and fate, which is embodied in like rolling dice and things. I think a lot of these old games kind of really played on that, and that playing just dice games was often seen as something that was linked to this idea of fate and destiny and the gods and their kind of will. So and so that's an example of a metaphor coming through physical form that's quite fundamental, I guess, to a lot of games. And I can kind of see out of the corner of my eye that a lot of things appeared in the chat. I don't know, Mickey, if you've seen any particular questions you want to bring up. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the player can be like the bug in the system sometimes. But yeah, I was actually talking to Kirsten about this before because I attended her panel previously, and they were talking a lot about playtesting and how you need to understand the player in order to iteratively go back and improve and hone your game. And part of that is seeing into another person's mind, kind of using these theory of mind skills to try and second guess how somebody else sees the world, essentially. And there's huge amounts of value in that as a kind of social project and social enterprise, as well as just like to design better games. But on the flip side of that, I have some students who approach game design, usually more video game design than board game design, although it's not like a kind of exclusionary thing, as being a form of self-expression, and they just want to tell their story. They want to make a kind of semi-autobiographical game, or they want to have the catharsis of putting an experience out there as they experienced it. And it's not that it's not a point of communication, and that they want to share it, obviously, on some level. So they want to know, do other people feel this way? Am I alone? You know, the reason why we all kind of create art, I suppose, is to reach out and be like, hello, I exist. Does anybody else perceive me? But then, of course, playtesting and trying to step into the shoes of the player doesn't make so much sense in that case, because actually they don't really care if the other player has fun. It's more about they are just sharing their view of the world, I suppose. So yeah, I think, but then again, games are play, and part of play is experimentation, and part of play is, if you just obey the rules of the game, are you really playing? Like, play actually implies some subversion at some level, some, not necessarily subversion, but some appropriation of the rules. And so, yeah, I think inherently, it's always going to be something that we butt into, which is like, actually the player is not really playing if they're just doing what they're told.
I think there are also some quite logistical problems as a designer that one can run into when thinking about players. And if we think about narrative games, a lot of them are campaign or legacy style games, which require multiple play sessions. Many adults struggle to schedule in the time to meet with their friends to play the game. And so the play session and the narrative experience ends up being quite protracted and quite drawn out. I have campaign games started years ago that I haven't finished yet. And that certainly has an impact on the reception and experience of the narrative. Also, you know, when players or when people sit down to read a book, they're not expecting to compete with it, right? They don't need to make any strategic decisions in order to turn the page. Players of board games are very different. They want to win. A story is nice as well, but we also want to beat the monster, find the cure, whatever it is. And so there are some logistical challenges that the kind of presence of the player presents when you are constructing, designing, writing the story for these kinds of games. But I think there are hopefully some really interesting opportunities that arise from those challenges as well. How can you make a legacy game be able to play over the course of 3 years and be a really sustained and impactful experience, so that when we finally do finish it, we mourn the loss of the end of the story. So lots of challenges, but lots of really interesting opportunities too.
I think the randomness of the player is, like you say, it's both an opportunity and a kind of risk. And I mean, the most obvious thing is kind of like game balance. And if it's a cooperative narrative game like Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, where you're asking players to solve something, then obviously there's randomness in their ability to do that, and so you're controlling for that to some degree. But I guess more relevant for what we're talking about now, and in some ways more interesting, is the randomness of how they will engage with the story, how they will interpret it, how they will emotionally respond to it. And I think when I'm designing stuff, I have potential kind of emotional experiences in mind for players, but I'm also aware that not every player is going to necessarily experience that. But it's almost like a range of options, right, that I have in mind. And I'm like, well, some players will experience this and some players won't, but at least they'll get this. And so, like, particularly in my Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective set, in the fourth case, I basically wanted to create what could be a very emotional experience, because I didn't know of many narrative games that dealt with emotional experiences like grief and loss. And I wanted to kind of put that into a context of a Sherlock Holmes mystery. But I also was aware that that might affect some players and reach some players in the way I intended, but also a lot of players would just play it for the mystery and not really necessarily engage with that. So that randomness was something I kind of just accepted and put in there, and just to have seen that some players have connected with it in that way is really satisfying to know that that worked. And I think it's great sometimes. It goes back to what I said in the original thing I was presenting about the fact that players can do things in games and create interactions and narratives that, as a designer, you don't expect. And that can be really great. That can be fascinating and amazing. And I guess that's something about games that doesn't really happen in other narrative forms, particularly. But like, I remember testing Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, and there were moments when people would like solve the case in a way I had never expected was possible. I had no idea it was coming, and they would like come out with something like, well, hang on a minute, if that guy was there at that time, why didn't he do the murder then? Because it would have been a lot easier. And I'm sitting there watching thinking, wow, that's a really good point. Why? So, and basically they're then like, so that means it must be this person. I'm like, oh my God, they've just solved it, and they haven't even gone to the 3 places I thought they had to go to. And that kind of thing is like, whoa, there's like this game thing I've created that's got a life of its own. That is really kind of satisfying, and I guess has some implications for art that can do that. I mean, it's almost like I didn't create that experience. I mean, who did? It's weird. So it's kind of art that almost can take on a life of its own if it's done in that way. I'm aware we've got to finish in a minute, so there's some more stuff in the chat, but I guess, Mickey, we should wind it down now, right? Yeah, cool. Well, I'm going to have a read through the comments. I can see them here once we finish. Yeah, so I'm at Dave Neale Writer on Twitter. And as I mentioned at the beginning, me and Emma are on Clubhouse on Sundays at 12:30. No, I have to get this right. 12:30 Eastern time, 5:30 UK time. Talking about different aspects of games and cultural and psychological aspects. And this Sunday we're talking about, can games change the world? So if you can get on Clubhouse, I'm just at Dave Neale. And I think, Emma, you are maybe at Emma Reay, I think. So yeah, that's me. Emma, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm at Emma Joy Reay, like JOYREAY, on Twitter and Instagram. Although Instagram is mainly just pictures of my cats. So if you want, but yes, I guess like a closing point, I think I just wanted to add was that there's this new space between digital and analog now, which I think is like really exciting, and it is a bit gimmicky at the minute in the sense that it's about the tech, not about the story. But I'm wondering, like, to what extent that intersection can actually solve some of the friction that comes out in just looking at analog narrative games, in the sense that if you have a great story, you want to be told the story and you want to get to the end of the story. And if something is blocking you from accessing the end of the story, then you can end up with frustration that's not good frustration, as in like totally in the Sherlock Holmes game, you want challenge, but at the end of the day, you don't want to be barred from getting the narrative conclusion. And I wonder whether, that interim space might actually help, because it might shift the emphasis onto like the world rather than the character, and away from like novel style telling stories of like the interiority of one's psychology, and actually go more into kind of the ensemble type of story that you get in soap operas and sitcoms and that kind of thing, where the world and the space that you can inhabit is more than the than like the what actions individual characters take and so on. So yeah, I'm really excited by this discussion, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the conference. And yeah, please do reach out on social media, or you can email me. My email address is ejr73@cam.ac.uk.
Twitter @Kirsten Dupree, just my name. I don't tweet a lot, I retweet a lot. I think that everyone else has much more interesting things to say than I do. So that's mostly what my feed is about. But this was really lovely. And Dave, I'm really excited to play your longer than a novel set for Sherlock Holmes. I love the game, so I'm really excited.
Cool. Thank you, everybody. That's the end of this panel. And
thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much.